Here we go. Everybody, take a deep breath in. And out. And crick.
Crack.
Crick.
Crack.
So once upon a time, a couple hundreds of years ago, in Ireland, it was the hard times. England had control, and the Irish were really struggling with famines, and there was just not enough money to go around. And amidst this time, there was a village, and in that village lived a man by the name of Brian O'Brenaghan. Now, every evening, he would go to the village pub and he would sit with his friends and they would talk and they would sing songs, and invariably, someone would turn to Brian and say, "Hey, Brian, tell us a story." And Brian would always say, "Oh, no. I don't know any stories. I can't tell a story." And they would all laugh and say, "Oh, Brian, the man who thinks he can't tell a story." And they would go on telling their own stories and jokes. Well, at this time, everyone, they had such a hard time making enough to get by, making a living, that what people would do for a little bit of extra change, they would go down to the stream and they would cut the reeds, and they would gather the reeds together, weave baskets, and sell the baskets for a few cents. And this way, they just made a little bit extra money for their bread. But everyone had already cut all of the reeds from the stream. So when Brian went down one day, nothing left. He remembered something. Outside of the village was this valley, and it was called by the villagers the Valley of the Fairies, because they said the fairies lived there. It was a wild place. No one ever went there. And the reason is, when we think of fairies nowadays, we think of little small things that fly around with fairy dust, and they're very sweet. But in the old days, the fairies of Ireland, they were dangerous creatures of magic. You didn't know what they were going to do. You didn't mess with them. So the people never went to the Valley of the Fairies. But because it was a valley, there was a stream flowing through it. And Brian thought, since no one goes there, if I went there, I could get tons of reeds. So he decided he would do it. He told his wife. She said, no, Brian, you can't go. And he said, I need to get bread for the family. And finally, she was convinced. And so she prepared a nice lunch for him, and he brought with him some rope to wrap the reeds up with and a knife. And the next morning, he set off. And he made his way out of the village all the way to the Valley of the Fairies. And as soon as he entered in, well, his heart was racing. He didn't know what was going to happen to him. All around him, the trees were tangled and dark. And he made his way through those trees, waiting for something to happen. And when a stick broke, he would spin around, and there was nothing there. And he kept on going deeper and deeper. And when nothing actually happened, he started to get a little bit more calm. And finally, he heard the sound of shh. And he went running down, and sure enough, there were tons of reeds. And so immediately, he put his lunch down, and he got in the stream, and he went to work, cutting the reeds and bundling them up into big bundles, throwing them on the shore, and doing it over and over again, until finally, the sun was getting up in the sky, and he was getting hungry. He thought, I've done so much already, I'm going to have a bite to eat. So he went and he sat down under a tree, and he opened his lunch, and he had a nice good lunch. And you know when you've got a full belly and the sun's shining on you and you've done a lot of work, how do you feel?
Tired.
Exactly. And that's how Brian felt. He thought, just take me a little nap. And he leaned back against the tree and he fell fast asleep. And when he woke up, he thought, that was good. I feel very rested. And then he opened his eyes and he discovered that the sun wasn't up in the sky as when he'd left it. Rather, the sun was about to set. And he jumped up and he said, "Oh no, what was I thinking? This is the Valley of the Fairies. I can't be here at the dark." And he grabbed his reeds and he started running this way and that. But he was tripping over roots and rocks, and before you knew it, it was dark. And he was lost in the Valley of the Fairies. Well, his heart was racing. His eyes were spinning left and right. Where was he going to do? What was he going to do? And then he noticed a light through the trees. And he thought to himself, where there's a light, there might be people. And so he made his way through the trees, and sure enough, there was a cabin there. And so he walked up to the door, and he knocked on the door. And the door opened with a creak. And standing in the doorway was a handsome woman. And she said, "Oh, Brian, we've been expecting you. Come in." And Brian, how did this woman know him? He was thinking to himself, but he didn't even have a chance to ask because she ushered him in, and she sat him down on a bench in front of a warm fire. And there on a rocking chair on his side was an old man rocking back and forth. And he looked over to Brian with a twinkle in his eye, and he said, "So Brian, you got a story for us?" And Brian said, "Oh, no, I'm sorry. I don't know any stories." And the woman came up and said, "But Brian, everyone knows a story or two." And he said, "No, not me. I'm Brian O'Branahan, the man who has no stories." And she said, "Well, whenever a guest comes, we ask them for a story. And since you can't give us a story, perhaps you can do another favor. Perhaps you can take this bucket, take it down to the stream where you are, fill it up with water, and bring it in for the night so we have water to drink and cook with." And Brian was happy to do this. He jumped up and he said, "Anything, ma'am." And he picked up the bucket and he went out of the house and down to the stream. When he got there, he filled the bucket with water. And you know, in Ireland, it was tradition that you don't bring a dripping bucket into someone's house. You wait until all the drops fall off, so you don't make their floor wet. And as Brian was holding it, watching the drops fall off, suddenly, just as the last drop was about to fall, a huge wind started to blow. It blew from the south, and it blew so hard, shoom, he was lifted off the ground, blown towards the north. And then a wind from the west blew him to the east, and from the east to the west, and the north to the south, and whoa, boom, he landed. And as he looked around, he found he was in a totally different place. This wasn't the same forest he had just been in. And he was terrified. What's going on? The Valley of the Fairies, they're going to get me. And as he looked around hectically again, he noticed a light. And again he thought, perhaps there's people when there's a light. And so he made his way through the trees and he came to this other cabin. And this one had a bright light and there seemed to be lots of activity inside. But he went up to the door and he knocked on the door. And as soon as the door opened, there was this flood of light and warmth and activity and sound. And he looked inside and there was a huge wake, a party celebrating someone who has died. And standing in the door was a young woman. And she said, "Oh, Brian, just in time." And he said, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt this wake. I have no business here. And she said, "Oh, but you do. Come inside." And before he could ask her how she knew his name, he was inside, around all of this activity. And before he could say another word, she said, "Brian, you know, we've been needing a fiddler to play the music for this night. You're just in time. Come on, here you go." And she stuck a fiddle under his chin. And he said, No, I can't play the fiddle." And she said, "Oh, Brian, come on." And she pushed him up onto a chair. And before he knew what he was doing, this music was just coming out of his fingers. He was playing the fiddle faster and faster, and everyone stopped their talking. They started clapping and dancing harder and harder as he played faster and faster until bang, 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 the strings broke and everyone burst into cheers and said, "Oh, Brian, you're amazing. You're the best fiddler in Ireland." And Brian looked down. He couldn't believe this. And he stepped off the chair. But he didn't even have a second to rest, because just then the woman came up and said, "Oh, Brian, now we need someone to give a speech for the person who has died." And Brian said, "Oh, but I don't even know that person. How can I?" She said, "Oh, Brian, go on." And she pushed him on the chair. And before he knew it, these words were just coming out of his mouth. And everyone was listening, enthralled. And they were crying, and they were laughing, and they were hugging. And when finally it was done, they burst into cheers and said, "Oh, Brian, the best speaker in Ireland." And he got off the chair. And the woman said, "Now, everybody, time to take the coffin to the graveyard." And so here was the coffin. And they had 3 men to carry the coffin on their shoulders, but there was a problem. One man was very tall, one man was very short, and one man was kind of in the middle. So when they put the coffin on their shoulders, it was all these funny angles, and it wouldn't do to have it like that. So the woman turned to Brian and said, "Hey, Brian, I hear you're a mighty fine surgeon." And he said, "Oh, no, I've never done anything like that." She said, "Come on." And she handed him a saw. And before he knew what he was doing, he was chopping off parts of the tall man's legs and attaching them to the short man's legs until suddenly they were all the same size. And they put that coffin on their shoulder and they took it marching off through the dark forests of the Valley of the Fairies. And they were marching in a long procession all the way through the darkness with Brian at the back looking around nervously. And they finally came to the old stone walls of the cemetery. And there they found the gates were locked. So they couldn't go through the gate. They had to go over the wall. So they passed the coffin over and all the people climbed over the wall. And last was Brian. And as he was right on top of the wall, about to jump over, all of a sudden, a huge wind blew from the south and knocked him right off the wall. And from the north to the south and from the east to the west, he was twisted around in the air until finally, boom, the wind stopped. And he looked around nervously and he saw the waters of the stream rushing by. And there was his bucket. And he was just in time to see the last drop go, bloop. So he picked up his bucket, what else could he do? And he walked back towards the light, the first light, and he knocked on the door. And that handsome woman opened up and said, "Oh, Brian, come on inside." And he walked inside in shock. He put the bucket down. He walked over to the fire, sat down on the bench, and that old man was sitting there still in the rocking chair. And he looked over to Brian with a twinkle in his eye, and he said, "So, Brian, you got a story for us?" And Brian, he thought about all the things that had just happened to him, and he said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I do." And he told them everything. And when he was done, they said, "Oh, Brian, after all you said, turns out you're one of the best storytellers in all of Ireland." And after that, they gave him a wonderful dinner and a fine feather bed to sleep in. And when he woke up the next morning, there was no feather bed. There was no cabin, no handsome woman or old man. It was just him and his bundle of reeds and his knife lying under the clouds and the trees in the Valley of the Fairies. Well, he wasn't going to take any more risks. He jumped up, he took his reeds, and he charged right out of the Valley of the Fairies, right back home. And when he got home, his wife came running out and said, "Oh, Brian, where were we? You thought the fairies got you." And he said, "Well, maybe they did. Let me tell you what happened." And he told them the whole story. And when he was done, she said, "Oh." And that night when he was at the pub and all of his friends did their usual joke and said, "Hey, Brian, tell us a story," they were shocked when he actually did. And you know what? It was such a good story that we're still telling it to this very day. Crick?
Crack.